Hello everyone, and welcome back to the next review video for the Biology or Living Environments regions. This is Unit 4, Topic 2, Part 1, going over ecology. Now this is a very important one for you to know, as lots and lots of questions on the region center around this topic, so it's very important you have a good understanding of it for the test. So the first thing you want to know are the levels of an ecosystem, or how ecosystems are organized. So the most specific one you want to remember is a population, which are all organisms of a specific species in a given area. So we'll use moose for this example. One moose would be an individual, and then multiple moose together in a given area forms your population. So all the moose in an area is your moose population. The next one you have is a community, and the community is a group of all living things in an area. So you take all the populations in a specific area, and then counting all those together is your community. So if you take the moose population, then the beaver population, and the bunny population, and you put all those together, and those are all your populations in an area, then that's a community. And then the next one is the ecosystem. And the ecosystem are all living and non-living things in an area. So you take your community that you just made of all the different populations, and then you add all the non-living or abiotic factors in the region. And that can include the water, the soil, the temperature, the amount of rainfall, the amount of sunlight, and all those living and non-living things coming together form your ecosystem. So now we're going to look at what abiotic factors are. So your abiotic factors are all the non-living factors that affect an ecosystem. So some examples of these that are important are things like soil and the nutrient content in soil for plants, the amount of water in an ecosystem, the oxygen levels, and the temperature. These are all examples of abiotic factors that affect an ecosystem. Now, the second one are biotic factors, and your biotic factors are all your living things. So all your living things in an ecosystem, including plants, animals, other bacteria, those are all examples of biotic factors. And the combination of both biotic and abiotic factors forms the larger ecosystem. Now, the next one are requirements of an ecosystem to sustain itself, and these are really the necessary components to have a stable ecosystem. The first one is that you need constant energy source. So you need some form of energy that's always being input into the system, and for most ecosystems, this is the sun, providing solar energy that can be transformed into other forms of energy, or specifically chemical energy by plants. And that's actually the second thing you need for an ecosystem to sustain itself, is that you need plants or organisms that can convert that solar energy into your chemical energy. So this is important so that other organisms, like all your heterotrophic organisms that eat others, have something to actually get their energy from. So the plants can convert that solar energy into chemical energy, which is then passed throughout the entire system. Okay, so now we're going to look at the various relationships in an ecosystem. The first are the nutritional relationships, which are how organisms make food. So number one, we have producers, which includes all of our plants, and these are the ones that are making their own food. So the plants are taking that solar energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis, they generate their own nutrients and they make their own food. So they don't have to eat anything else. The second one are herbivores or herbivores, which get their food by eating plants. So these are also often called primary consumers, which are the ones that eat plants. So examples like grasshoppers, small organisms, you can say deer. These are all things that eat plants, and these are your primary consumers or herbivores. Now the next one you have are carnivores, which are also called secondary consumers, and these are the ones that eat the other animals. So things like frogs. Frogs will eat insects, so they're secondary consumers because the insects are often primary consumers, eating various plants, and then the frogs are secondary consumers as they go back and eat those insects. And then next you have omnivores. Omnivores like humans, we can eat both plants and animals. Another example of this would be black bears. They can eat berries, honey, nuts, but they also eat other bees and insects. So omnivores can do both. They're a mix of both herbivores and carnivores. And now the final one, which is, I guess, slightly harder to remember for some people, is decomposers. And decomposers are examples like your mushrooms. These break down decaying organisms and then return those nutrients to the soil for plants to use. So if you find mushrooms that are living on a tree, these are breaking down like a dead tree that's fallen on the ground. They're taking the nutrients from that dead tree, breaking it down, and then returning it into the soil for later plants to use. So these have a key role in recycling nutrients, which we will look at slightly later in the video. Okay, so now we're going to look at the symbiotic relationships, which are how different organisms interact with each other. So the first one we have is mutualism or mutualistic relationships, and these are where both organisms benefit. So in a mutualistic relationship, one organism does something that helps the other, and the other organism will help the other. So an example of this would be our bacteria in our intestines. All humans have E. coli in their intestines, which is beneficial for us because it allows us to break down various foods, and it's beneficial for E. coli as we supply it with nutrients and we also give it protection and a stable place to live, which is inside our intestines. The second one is commensalism, which is the one that's often forgotten. And this is where one benefits, so one organism is going to benefit, and the other is not affected. So this helps one, and the other one doesn't really care, so they just let it happen. And an example of this would be barnacles on the whale. For the whale, it doesn't not the barnacles don't really affect it in any way, but for the barnacles, it gives them a stable place to live and allows them transportation, which will help them with various different things. So barnacles are on a whale are an example of commensalism. And the final one is parasitism, or with parasites, which is where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. So a good example of this are tapeworms in humans. In humans, if you don't know, tapeworms can be found in our small intestines. And what they do is they basically just take all the food that we eat and they eat all the food and take all the nutrients that we should be getting. And it's great for the tapeworm because they get for like free housing and a bunch of free food, but it's really bad for the human because they're not getting enough nutrients, they're often nutrient deficient because of it, and they're always hungry because the food that you're eating doesn't actually go. So one organism is helped while the other one is harmed. Now we're going to look at food chains and food webs. So these have a key role, and they help us understand how the energy is moving throughout an organism. So their role is to model the flow of energy throughout an ecosystem, between different organisms. And the arrows that you see in this represent the direction of energy flow. So arrows are energy flow. And there are two different ways this can be represented. The first is a food chain, which we have an image of right down here. The food chain shows the direction of energy straight in one direction. Energy flows in one direction and is not recycled. And it really just shows the direct transfer of energy. So in our diagram here, we can first see that it starts with the producer, which is grass. It's cut off by the image, but it really starts with the sun providing energy to the grass, which is a producer. Then from there, the arrow points to the grasshopper, which shows that energy flows to the grasshopper, meaning the grasshopper is eating the grass. One thing you want to remember about the arrows do not represent organisms eating other organisms, but rather the energy being flowed. So obviously the grass is not eating the grasshopper. The grasshopper would be eating the grass, so the energy from the grass then goes to the grasshopper. Then we see the shrew is our secondary consumer, which eats the grasshopper, and the energy then goes to the shrew. And then finally, our tertiary consumer, or the third consumer, is the owl, which eats the shrew and then gains the energy from the shrew. So next one, we have food webs. And food webs are slightly more complicated, and they show the interconnected food chains in an ecosystem. So the food web is basically taking multiple food chains and showing how they all interact in an ecosystem. Because as we know, in many ecosystems, it's not just one organism eats one other organism, which eats one other organism, and then which is a plant and makes energy from the sun. It's often a lot more complicated and shows a complex relationship. So, for example, we can see here that, let me just take this, the fruit fly right here gains its energy from the mangoes. So it only eats mangoes, but then multiple different organisms eat the fruit flies. It can either be eaten by this bird right here, the thrush, it can be eaten by dragonflies, it can be eaten by frogs, and then from there it can go to various other places. Like the thrush are eaten by eagles and wolves, the dragonfly is eaten by frogs and the thrush, and we can just see that it's a very complex web. And now, just again, to remember that arrows show the direction of energy flow. The arrow goes from the mango to the fruit fly, which means that the fruit fly is gaining energy from the mango, not that the mango is eating the fruit fly, because that obviously would not make a lot of sense if the mango was eating flies. Okay, so the next thing we want to look at here are energy pyramids. And energy pyramids show energy being transferred throughout and show the different levels of consumers. So the key thing you want to remember is that energy is lost as it's transferred from one level to another. That means that as we go from our producers to our primary consumers to secondary consumers, energy is lost. And the reason this is lost is that it is lost as heat. This is a key thing you want to remember, and they often ask us questions about it, is that energy is lost as heat, which is because organisms use their energy for metabolic processes, and heat is always given off into the environment. So our energy does not get perfectly transferred every time an organism eats another organism. Rather, they only get a small portion of that energy. And because energy is lost as we go up, that means that the greatest energy available, or greatest amount of energy, is located at the bottom of the pyramid. So this, as we know, at the very bottom of the pyramid, as you can also see on the right in the image, are producers. And even before producers, if you want to know where the real greatest amount of energy is, it comes from the sun with the light, which gives our original energy. But then within our food chain, the producers have the most amount of energy. And here we have a diagram of that. You can see that as we go up, there's less and less energy available, and that these little arrows demonstrate it's being lost as heat. Also, the fact that there are decomposers on the side show that decomposers, while don't have a specific part in the food chain where they eat one organism and are eaten by another, the decomposed. They help to recycle the nutrients from various different stages and different organisms from across the pyramid. So those are energy pyramids. The next thing we're going to look at are population dynamics, and this is really just how a population affects another. So there are two things you want to know about this, and it's carrying capacity and the limiting factors. So your carrying capacity represents the greatest number of organisms in a population that the environment can support. So it's really just the maximum amount of organisms that can survive in the environment. And this is determined and controlled by various limiting factors. So the carrying capacity, as we know, there obviously can't be an infinite number of organisms in an environment, as there are various things that constrain that. So limiting factors are the things that constrain the carrying capacity. So limiting factors can include amount of food, it can include the number of predators, it can include the amount of light, it can include the amount of space. These are all different factors that are reasons why the carrying capacity can't go any higher. So on the right, we have a diagram of the number of deer over time, and we can see that as it approaches the carrying capacity, it obviously slows down, and the number of deer can't go above the carrying capacity. That's just because we don't know why, but I could either be there isn't enough food for all the deer, or there are too many predators for the deer, but the deer population can only reach that maximum, which is a carrying capacity. Okay. A few more things left in this lesson. The next one is bioaccumulation, which is really just the buildup of toxic chemicals. So what you want to know is that toxic chemicals increase up the food chain. And this is a result of negative human action. So we see this primarily with seafood, as shown in the image in the right. Things like runoff from pesticides and other like sewage treatment plants on coastal areas all cause contaminants to leak into the oceans. These are eaten by small organisms, whether it's made in like algae, but it gets in small organisms. So these small organisms have a little bit of contamination, but as the larger organisms eat them, they gain all the contaminants from the larger organism. So as we see over time, as organisms continue eating, it goes from like barely anything to slightly more, and then our larger organisms, or our tertiary consumers, have a high level of these contaminants, which is often the reason why, if you ever heard that pregnant women shouldn't eat lots of things like tuna, that's because they have large levels of contaminants due to bioaccumulation. So what you want to know for this is that as you go up the food chain, there are more and more toxic chemicals. Now, the next one we have is succession. An ecological succession is the predictable change or the predictable changes that occur in an ecosystem until an ecosystem is reached. So what this means is that after any form of disruption, or if there is no life in an area, we see life comes back and the ecosystem can be restored. So this is really just predictable changes in an ecosystem. And there are two types of succession that you want to know. The first is called primary succession, and this is when there is no soil or organisms. So this is really just starting from basically nothing. You don't have any living factors in the region, and there's no soil in the region. And because of this, it takes a longer time. This is going to take, and this makes sense because you don't really have a lot to start with. You have to build up all these things from practically nothing. And the second type is called secondary succession, which is when soil and organisms are already present. So this means that either something got disrupted, but you still have soil in the ground, or you already have some organisms like small plants, and because of this, it will take a shorter amount of time. And this also makes sense because you don't have to really rebuild the entire system. You already have kind of the starting blocks, so you can eliminate that extra time. And you want to know why this occurs? It's because it's after the ecosystem is disrupted. So for example, if you have a natural disaster like a flood or a forest fire or deforestation that destroys various parts of the ecosystem, it's obviously not going to destroy all the soil in every organism possible, but it will largely damage it, and then this is when secondary succession would occur. Or if you have something that humans have like left behind, so they have like a city and you abandon the city over time, it will continue and to regrow. Now, the final thing we have in this lesson is the cycling of materials, and we have in parentheses here not energy. This is a key thing you want to know because it's rather the materials that are getting cycled between living and non-living parts, but not the energy. So various materials, including carbon, nitrogen, and water, are cycled throughout an ecosystem. So certain a good example of this is with carbon dioxide and oxygen, where all living things need to do cell respiration, which obviously takes in oxygen and leaves out carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide is taken in through photosynthesis, and then the plants produce oxygen. So that's an example of cycling that can occur. And the other thing you want to know are that decomposers are very important for recycling various nutrients, because as we know, they break down the nutrients of decaying matter, like dead trees or anything else, and they can then put those nutrients back into the soil and into the environment. So decomposers really help with the cycling of materials. So here we have some review questions. We have a lot of review questions because this comes up it's very common on Regents, and many of these are actually from the same test. So first we have question number 1. The diagram below represents an energy pyramid. In this pyramid, the greatest amount of stored energy is found at level, then we have A, B, C, or D. So this is really just testing our knowledge about which one has the most amount of energy. And if we remember, every time energy is transferred, it is lost as heat. So when we go like this, some heat is lost, and then that happens every single time we go up. So our best answer here would be choice number 4, or letter D, because there is no energy being lost as heat, and that's where we find the most amount of energy in the pyramid. Okay, we'll go down to our next one. We'll just go to the one to the right, number 12. The diagram below represents a food web. Which statement best describes a relationship represented in the diagram? Number 1. Bushes are herbivores that feed on insects. I really hope no one will be circling this answer or something like this on the Regents. We know that bushes are not eating the insects. This is the key thing about what the arrows represent. The arrows don't represent the organisms feeding on one another, but rather the energy. Because right here we see the arrow going from bushes to insects, that means the energy from the bush goes to the insects. So rather, insects are feeding on bushes, not bushes eating insects. That would be kind of crazy. Number 2, it says rodents are consumers that feed on lizards. Here we have rodents, and lizards are over here, and rodents are over here. So we don't see a direct arrow between the two, so this one would not be our best answer. Next one, we have roadrunners are carnivores that feed on insects. We can see here an arrow going from insects to roadrunners, so insects give their energy to roadrunners, and we know that insects are organisms. So this one would be our best answer, because eating another organism means that you're a carnivore, and roadrunners are carnivorous, and they're feeding on these insects. So just to be careful, we'll check number 4. We see grasses are producers that are eaten by lizards. So while grasses are producers right here, we're missing an arrow between grasses and lizards. So lizards don't directly eat grass. So number 4 would not be our answer, and number 3 would be our best. We'll go down here to number 5. It says, a farmer stopped maintaining a field that was once used to grow crops. Over time, the field eventually became a forest. These changes best illustrate the process of... Number 1 is ecological succession, and this would be our best answer because, as we remember, succession is when it's a predictable changes that occur from an ecosystem. So we have a field, it has soil, and then over time it eventually becomes a forest. So this would represent secondary succession. But we'll look through the rest of our answers. First, we have nutrient recycling. So this doesn't exactly represent nutrient recycling because that would be something with decomposers putting nutrients back in the soil, which we're not seeing with this question. Next is decomposition, which we're also not seeing any decomposers. And the final one is competition. We don't see any examples of competition between various organisms or anything else happening on this field, so that would not be our answer. And our best one would be number 1. Next is number 22, which says, which statement best describes a characteristic of the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. Number 1, it says that it can be illustrated with a food web. This one would not be our best answer because the food web only shows the interactions or the nutritional interactions between organisms, not how many organisms can exist in an ecosystem, and that's what a carrying capacity is. Next, we see it allows organisms to produce populations of unlimited size. So this one is definitely not our answer because the entire point of a carrying capacity is to show that is the maximum amount of organisms. Organisms cannot exist in infinite numbers due to various limiting factors in the region. Next, we say it is determined directly by an organism's reproductive success. This one would not be our answer. While if organisms don't have much reproductive success, they'll likely die off. That doesn't determine the maximum amount of them in an ecosystem or in a given environment, as that's rather chosen by environmental factors. So now we'll look at number 4, which hopefully should be our answer, that says it is limited by the habitat's available energy and nutrients. This would be our best answer here because the available energy in the environment can control what organisms exist. For example, if there isn't a lot of food, then the carrying capacity will be lower because a specific organism won't be able to get enough food. So number 4 would be our best answer there. Next one, second to last one, is number 30. Some organisms in an ecosystem are represented in the period below. In the pyramid, the arrows labeled X represent. So we can see the arrows labeled X are right here, and they're being given off from all the different levels. So we want to know what that is. And if we remember that this is the loss of energy and it occurs in the form of heat. So we'll look through our answers, see which one is best. One is the loss of organisms due to predation. This is not true, as the predators, that would be arrows going like this, where they're being eaten by others. So that would not be our best answer. Number 2 is a decrease in the photosynthetic organisms. That would not be true. If that was true, that would be only for the plants, as we see it occurring for like the wolves and the snake populations, which we know are not photosynthetic. So number 2 would not be our best answer. Number 3 is the loss of energy in the form of heat, which is true. That's what we saw earlier. And number 4 is a decrease in available oxygen. There's no reason why that would be the best answer, or why that would be what's represented by X. So number 3 here is our best answer. Finally, we have one last question. Base your answers to questions 5 and 6. I only put 5, but on the diagram below, and based on your knowledge of biology. Which statement most accurately predicts the result of interfering with populations in the web? Number 1, we have removing the cricket population will have little effect on the balance of the food web. So we know immediately that this one is not our answer, as removing any organism in an ecosystem can disrupt the entire food chain and balance. As we see, frogs eat crickets, which are then eaten by the hawks, which could really throw off the populations. Second, removing all the mountain lions from the food web will benefit the ecosystem. This one is definitely not our answer for really the same reason as before. Removing all of one organism from an ecosystem is really going to damage it, because the mountain lions eat, as we can see, rabbits and deer. If there's no one eating the rabbits or the deer, then there will be too many organisms eating the trees and the grass, which will mean there's not enough food for the crickets and the mice, and it will really disrupt the entire ecosystem. Next, removing the cricket and rabbit population would cause the number of trees to decrease. So we will look, I guess this one, we'll look, the crickets here are eating the grass, and the rabbits are also eating the grass, and a number of these are eating the trees, so there's not really a direct relationship there, but we can, I guess, come back to number 3 after. If we'll look at number 4. Number 4 says, removing the deer from the food web will affect the rabbit and grass population. So this one would likely be our best answer, because we can see that the deer directly eat the grass, as per this arrow here, and if they're not eating the grass, that means that there's going to be more grass available, and then more rabbits and crickets eating the grass means that the rabbit and cricket population would then grow. So removing the deer would affect the grass population directly, and then, sorry, not the cricket. So it would affect the grass population because they eat the grass, and then that in turn would affect the rabbit population. So number 4 would likely be our best answer. And that's all for the video. Thank you for listening.